All right.
Yeah, I'm staying for.
Okay, we have a quick question. Yes.
No, I just want to leave for an appointment.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. What I want to do is I want to put up the database diagram that we had last time, and we talked about a flaw in it, and of course I had to think of a way to solve that in database terms. Because remember the point, and this is a big point as far as databases go, is that constraints built in the database are infinitely better than constraints implemented via code. And the reason for that is that constraints implemented in the code have to be done perfectly every time you write the code. So if you have a couple of different applications or a couple of different modules, let's say, that do an update of a database table or do inserts or deletes or whatever, if the constraints have to exist in the code, then they have to be right every time. Otherwise, you're going to get bogus data. You have the potential for bogus data. Whereas if the constraints are built into the database, then it doesn't matter by hook or by crook, you can't get invalid data in. So let me start by putting what we had up on the board last time, and then I'll expand it to talk about how we can solve it, how we can solve the issue. And if you remember, the issue was that a person could vote multiple times in a poll, and that would lead to potentially misleading results and so on and so forth. All right. This wouldn't prohibit, by the way, if someone were to register multiple times under different email addresses, because frankly, that's a different situation. But at any rate. All right, so we had a poll table, and the primary key to this was poll ID, and it had something like the question itself, the date created, and maybe the date that it expires. We had a one-to-many relationship then between that table and the list of answers. And we had a primary key of answer ID, foreign key of poll ID, and then the value for the answer. We had a user table. And we had user ID. Email address. Username, I guess. And or first name and last name. This might be slightly different than what we had before, but what their password is, and finally whether they're an admin or not. All right, and then lastly we had a vote table that had user ID and answers. That taken together was a primary key, or actually we did this, I think. We had a vote ID and we had a user ID and an answer ID. And I think this is a structure that we had. And the flaw with that was that we would have a potential, because this is a primary key, and we could create a unique index on that. A unique index indicates all right, would potentially have it. And again, I'm not saying that we couldn't control this via the program. We could. We could write code that would check to see if they voted before for this question, if they have an answer that relates to this question, and keep them from voting again. We could do that. But again, that would be a constraint that was implemented on the code level. And that is not as good as a constraint that's implemented on a database level. So what we would need to do to correct this, we could correct this, and the problem is using my favorite thing for keys, auto number keys. If we simply do not use auto number keys, we can solve this problem. And it would require changing two tables. This table would have a compound primary key now, consisting of poll ID and a sequence number. Sequence number is simply 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. How is that different from an auto number? An auto number is like a sequence number, but for the whole table. In other words, the first question would be 1, the second question would be 2, or the first answer would be 1, the second answer would be 2, and so on down the line. The sequence number means that for each question, there would be a 1, 2, and 3. So that's different. In the case of an auto number, there would be one number 10 in the entire database, or one number 2 in the entire database. In this case, there would be a number 2 for every question. All right, so that's a subtle difference between the two. So I would make this combination the primary key. The text of the answer. So that's the primary key. The primary key to this table becomes the user ID, the question ID, and the answer text. Or I'm sorry, the answer, the sequence number. And this is the primary key. This is also a foreign key to the user table. And this combination is a foreign key to the answer table. And in that way, we can't have a user answer the same question more than once. All right? And yet we've kept the integrity that that answer has to be a valid answer in the answer table. So by this little tweak, we're able to get around the issue. So this is a much better solution to the problem than the one I had up on the board on Thursday. Yes?
When you wrote question ID, do you mean poll ID?
Yes, I mean poll ID. I think at different times I've called those questions and polls, so yeah, that would be poll ID. And you know what? Those are good questions to ask when you're designing a database. In fact, when you're doing any sort of system development. None of you, I would assume, have had the systems class yet, have you? Or have any of you? Okay, a couple people have. In the system development class, you work on a project sort of from beginning to end. All right? And in other words, like the assignments in most classes are pretty well defined. In other words, you need to create a page that has this on it. Boom, 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 boom. And I make up those assignments, right? In a real project, you don't know what you need to do at first, right? They just know company A wants a website. Company B wants to process their customer service log. They don't know exactly what they want. It's your job to go and figure out what they need, actually, more so than what they want, even. Yes?
We have to build a database, right? So build basically what I'm
important part is that going into the problem, you don't know what you needed to do, right? You only had sort of a vague definition.
Yeah.
We want to process our donors. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. You have to figure that out, all right? And I was going to say, what brought on this rant? I know what it was. Your question of, when I said question ID, did I really mean poll ID? And I said yes, all right? Sometimes terminology can be very important because sometimes people use words as synonyms, in other words, meaning the same thing, but other times there's a slight difference, all right? In other words, well, no, a question is a little different than a poll, all right? Because, and then whoever wants the site created might have some reason why a question's a little different than that, all right? So it's important that you keep consistent terminology when you define these things, and it's important that if anything doesn't seem right, you ask about it. I'll give you an example. One job I had, I was going to say, was it a first job? No, it wasn't my first job. But one of the jobs that I had in the past was working in for a software company that developed software in the food industry. And they would talk about principals, and they would talk about manufacturers. All right? And it was confusing, because sometimes they'd be talking about principals, sometimes they'd be talking about manufacturers. Really, principals and manufacturers are the same thing. All right? It's just two different words, depending on sort of the perspective that you're looking at them. Another time, they talked about, in other cases, they talked about customers, they talked about distributors, and they talked about the distributor's customers, sometimes called end users or sometimes called operators. Well, that's a big old mess, right? Because all of these are sort of customers, right? Distributors, customers, operators, they're all kind of customers. But there's sort of different terms for these because it's like who's the customer of who, right? And who's our customer, and who's the manufacturer's customer, and who is the distributor's customer. So there were three terms that sounded like they might be synonyms, but actually distributor and customer meant the same thing, and an operator or an end user or the distributor's customer was something else. So the bottom line is terminology is important. And therefore, when you're working on a problem, it's important that you have a clear idea of exactly what we mean. I'm very excited because we have a solution to the multiple votes. All right? And that involves changing the keys around a little bit and getting rid of the surrogate keys. We're going to make the primary key to this table a poll ID and just a number, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have the answer text. This table, the primary key is going to be a combination of the user ID and the poll ID. And then there'll be a foreign key between the poll ID and the sequence number. So therefore, a user can only have one entry per poll. And that entry has to match up with an answer over here. So we have an answer to it. All right, so what's up next? What we're going to do now is we're going to work on some queries. And we're going to start by working on these tables. All right, so I'm going to make these two tables in a database. And we're going to do some simple queries on it. What are the queries going to look like? All right, I'm actually going to take a picture of this so I can post it. The updated, I know I could always go to the video, but all right, we're just going to do these two tables. And what are the queries going to look like? Well, we're going to repeat. We're going to repeat the first kind of query we had, where we're simply going to show a list of questions. So we're going to show the question or the poll and the two dates in a list. So that'll be the first one that we create. All right? The first query that we create, and we're going to put that on a web page. What would the select statement for that be? Just to show from the poll table, question, date, and date. Select. All right, very good. At least we have that part down.
Question, date created.
Right.
Date expires from poll.
Right. We could say, in fact, what I'm going to do, even though I'm not going to display the poll IDs, I'm going to select it. Because I'm going to need that in a minute. All right? So I'm going to select star from poll. And remember, a relational database returns stuff to you in the order that it feels like, essentially. The order that it depends, that it returns it in is going to depend on what the database feels like doing. Access, for example, will probably return this in primary key order. All right? But maybe we want it in some other order. Maybe we want it by the date that it expires. All right? How do we sort a query? Well, we can sort ascending and descending. So we can either put ASC or DESC after that. But how would I sort, for example, by date expires? If I wanted to do it ascending. So from the lowest to the highest date, from the oldest to the most recent date.
Order by.
Order by, exactly. So order by date expires. And I could do ascending, or if I omit it, it's assumed to be ascending. Now, the second page is going to show, for one question, it's going to show all the answers. So the second page is going to look like this. I'm going to show the question on the top, and I'm going to show the list of answers. All right? That's my goal for today, is to get through these two steps. All right? Now, question. How many queries do you think we're going to need to do this? I think there's two possible answers to this. What do you think? Okay, we have a vote for 2. And what would the 2 queries be?
One for getting the question. And one for the answers.
All right, and I would say that's right. All right, not to say that you couldn't do it with 1 query. You probably could, but this is probably best done by doing 2 queries. All right, so we're going to have it so that when you click on this page, click on the question, you're taken to this page. And this doesn't show every query. This only shows 1 query. All right? So, we're going to have 2 queries for this. And correspondingly, we're going to have 2 visual controls for this. All right? Let's go on and do this, and we'll come back to this guy when we're ready to do it. All right? So let me go and let me create these tables, put some test data in, and be off to the races here. By the way, I did find out why I was confused about the example that I downloaded. If you remember last time, I pulled something down. It's like, is this what we did on Tuesday? It wasn't what we did on Tuesday. It's what we did week 7 in spring semester. So I pulled down an old example. That's why I was confused. Like, this looks different.
But you did the same error.
But I made almost the same error in both of them. I spelled app data wrong. Spelled it wrong two different ways, but I spelled it wrong. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create my database. So blank desktop database. I am literally going to put it on the desktop for now. Later I am going to move it. And I'm going to call the database poll. Click create. Remember, Access gives you the one table for free. And Access has all these little things that are meant for people that aren't good with databases. All right? So they give you a very simplistic way of entering data into tables. And that's all well and good for sort of lower end users. You know, it gives them sort of some guidance into that. But for us, we don't want to use those tools. We want to go into design mode where we can make the tables the way we want to make them. So I'm going to go in here. And I'm going to go into design view. And I'm going to say poll is my table name. And the primary key to this is going to be poll ID. My question text, which is short text. That can be up to 255 characters, which is, I assume, big enough for this. I'm going to make a required field. Date created is a date time. Date expired is also a date time. Now I can give the date created a required date. Required. But I can make date expired not required, because I might have some poll questions that I don't ever want to expire. All right? Something that doesn't have a time component to it. What's your favorite holiday of the year? You know, you could have a list of holidays and, you know, that's never going to go out of style, right? Whereas date created, everything in here is going to have a created date. All right, so I've created my poll table. I'm going to close that. Do I want to save changes? Yes. I'm going to go and create a new table. Just kidding. By saying okay, create. When in doubt, look at the menu. Table. And I'm going to do the same thing for this. Going to go into design view. And I'm going to say answers. And the primary key to this is going to be a combination of poll ID, which is not an auto number. All right. It's an auto number if we want each one to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is not going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is going to match up with the poll ID in the poll table. So we might have 3 things that have a poll ID of 1. All right. We might have whatever. As many as we want to. So we're not going to automatically generate it. Nor are we automatically going to generate the sequence number, because remember, this is going to be, there's going to be, for every question, there's going to be an answer number 1. All right? As opposed to with an auto number, you would only get one per the whole database. So that's the difference sort of between a sequence number. And that, again, will also not be a number. Now, these things together form the primary key. There's a little trick for making a 2-part primary key. You simply select both rows here and click the primary key. And now both of those are listed as a primary key. And again, important terminology, that doesn't mean that this has 2 primary keys. It means it has a 2-part primary key. There's only one primary key to a database table. Now that key can have multiple parts, but there's only one thing that can be a key. An example of a two-part primary key here on campus would be the way the course names are given, right? For example, this is CISS243. All right, that's actually composed of two parts. There's a 4-character department ID, so CISS, and then there's roughly a sequence number, I guess you could call it, with just some numbering. You know, so CISS is the one part of it, 243 is another part. Now remember, it's a combination that has to be unique. So there can be other classes that are CISS classes, right? CISS 216, CISS 260, and so on down the line. And there can be other classes in other departments that are 243. So there could be a Math 243 or an English 243 or whatever. But there cannot be two classes that are CISS 243. So that's what it means to have a two-part primary key. So there could be a bunch of answer ones, but for each question there could only be one answer one. All right? And then I'm going to do answer text, which is a short text. And I think that covers the first two tables. All right? Almost. Almost. I said almost because we have foreign keys involved here, and you must establish a relationship for the foreign key to really be implemented. In other words, let me go save this. I have a poll ID in the answer table, and I have a poll ID in the poll table. That doesn't mean that they're a foreign key. The database doesn't make the association merely by name to say, well, these two things have the same name, therefore is a foreign key. You have to create the relationship. You have to establish the relationship. Now, how do you establish the relationship? You go into database tools, thank you. Relationships. And here's a list of the tables that you have. And you can add. And what you do is you literally drag the one field to the other. And it shows it to you to make sure you got it right, that you didn't go and link it to the wrong column and all that. And it tells us that it's a one-to-many relationship, which is good. All right? And then the other key thing that we have to do is we have to enforce referential integrity. I really can think of only limited circumstances where you would not enforce referential integrity. The only one I can think of is if you were converting data from, let's say, some Excel spreadsheets, and you didn't know if the data was valid or invalid. There could be all kinds of bogus data in Excel spreadsheets because there's no referential integrity. So you might bring in the data and not implement referential integrity. And then after you've looked at the data and cleaned it up and correct any mistakes, then you would implement referential integrity. If you're creating something from scratch, you nearly always would. I really can't think of a case where you would not implement referential integrity. You have some choices about how to cascade the deletes. And essentially what that means is if I get rid of the question, do I want to get rid of the answers? And yeah, I probably do. So I'm going to cascade deleted records. We'll talk more about this in a future class. It tells me that it's a one-to-many relationship, which is good. One poll has many answers. Each answer relates to one poll. It's important that you revisit this and look at this again to make sure that it's right. Because if you didn't do it right, it will show maybe a one-to-one relationship, or it will show a one-to-many relationship going in the wrong direction. All right? So this is kind of a good double check to make sure that the database that you've created and accessed matches a database that you designed. So take a look and pay attention for that. Now, You will not be able to create a foreign key if you have the other tables open somewhere else in Access. All right? So if it gives you an error saying that the other tables are open, you just have to go and close them. I remembered that, and so I closed all the tables before I tried to create the foreign key. You won't be able to create the foreign key if there's already bad data in your tables. What do I mean by bad data in this case? What would be an example of bad data in this case?
If your poll IDs didn't match.
Yeah, if I had, let's say, poll IDs in the poll table 1, 2, and 3, and I had something in the answer table for poll 4, all right? There is no poll 4 in the poll table. So therefore, it wouldn't allow me to create the foreign key, and I would have to clean up that data. I would have to correct it and delete it or change it or whatever, or add a new poll before I would be able to do that. Because of that reason, it's a good idea to create your foreign keys right from the start, because right from the start, you can't create bad data. All right. The other possibility would be if there's the wrong number of columns or the data types are different. Like if I tried to link a date to an integer, it would complain about that. Or if I were to try to have one column in one table mapping to 2 columns in the other table, it would tell me that that's not allowed. But we did everything is correct, so we can go in and we can add some data. And I'm going to start out just by adding a couple polls in here. So I'll go in here, and again, we want non-controversial polls. So we will say, what is your favorite energy drink? The date created will be today, and it never expires. Okay. Do you like Halloween? I noticed that I've gotten older, more grown-ups are into Halloween than there used to be. When I was like a little kid, Halloween was huge for little kids, but grown-ups really didn't care. You know, there might be a Halloween party or something, but no one really cared. But it seems like anymore, like people that aren't like little kids really are into Halloween. I don't know. So anyhow, and the date created, we'll again put today. And the date that expires will be 10/31. Okay. So I'm going to go and I'm going to write a query that will show me both of these. All right. And we'll get that working. And then we will work in the answers. So I'm going to close out of the database. Do I want to change? Yes, I do. Let's go into Visual Studio. And File, New, Website. I want to create an empty website. I want to put it on the desktop. And I want to call it Polls. And I can go and create that. So it created my polls folder on the desktop. It gave me the web config file. I now want to move the database underneath this folder. Now what's the name of the folder that I want to put it in? App_data. Does someone else want to come up here and do this? Because I have not gotten it right 2 semesters running. Let's go new folder, app_data. Did I do it? Yes, I did. All right. Now I want to move this folder, the database, into that folder. So I'll go and drag it over. All right. Again, this is convenient for grading because everything's underneath that folder. So your web config, all your pages, the database, if you had any custom classes, all of that will be under one folder. So all you have to do is zip up that folder and send it to me. And I just need to expand it on my machine and run it, and I should be good to go. Now, so I want to be able to see that app data folder, so I hit refresh here. And there it shows it to me. Now, nice thing is you can go and look at things in your database without like having to open up Access. That's a neat feature. So I can, for example, I can double click on this database and it will show me the database. I can see the tables that exist in it. Views, stored procedures, and functions are typically not used in Access, so it doesn't really show anything for those. But I could click on answers and I could see the columns that are there. I could click on poll and I could see the columns there. And I can even do a right mouse and say retrieve data, and it will show me, well, there's nothing in that table. But I can say retrieve data and it will show me the contents of that. So that's a nice feature to be able to do that without having to go all the way into Access. All right, so now I want to create a page that is going to show me the polls. Now again, this is a case of do what I say and not what I do. If you're doing a project, you should go and create a master page. All right. In fact, I'm going to go and do that. I'm just not going to put much on my master page. All right. I'm going to walk the walk. All right. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to at least do a rudimentary master page. So I'll go in here, new file, and I will create a web form. That's my default page. Oh no, I lied. I'll go and create a master page. Place code in separate file. Yes, I want to do that. And I'll go here and right now I'm just going to put a heading in here. Later on maybe I'll add a navigation just to practice that again. Okay, Zeller's Web Polls. And again, because I'm doing my best to be a good egg and do everything the right way, I'm also going to create a style sheet for this. So I'll go new file, style sheet, and I'm not going to change much in the style sheet, but I will say like font, family, colon, and look, it even gave me all these choices. Let's pick this one. And I'm going to do background, we'll do a very light gray, so I'll do RGB 200, 200, 200, and the text color I'll do a darker gray, RGB 55. All right. RGB is another way that you can specify colors. All right. Remember with our colors, when we have the hex code, we have 6 digits, 6 hex digits that are 3 pairs of 2. where the first two represent how much red, the second pair represent how much green, and the third pair represent how much blue. This is simply a different way to notate it, and it uses decimal numbers instead of hexadecimal numbers. So it's a little clearer for some students to use. So the values of a number can be anywhere from 0 to 255. The higher a number, the more of that color. So generally, the lighter or brighter the color will be. So the background is going to be a light gray. The text color is going to be a darker gray. So I'll go in here and I'll apply that style sheet. If we view this in design view, we see that's what it looks like. All right. So you can't accuse me of being a hypocrite. I went and did the things. I at least made some effort to make it look like a finished web page. You, of course, because you have much more time, could do even more than this. All right. So now I'm going to actually make my page. So I'm going to make my default page that is going to show me all the polls. So I will click Web Form. My default page, I want to be default.aspx. My home page, I want to be default.aspx. All right. I'm going to check Select Master Page. I'm going to select Add. I only have one master page, so that part's easy. And then I have my two content areas. And remember, that's where I can put code. Those content areas represent the blank spots, correspond to the content placeholders in the master page. Those are the blank spots. Those are the things that are going to vary with each page. Anything outside of that is common content that's going to be on every page that uses this master page. So I'm going to go here on my default page, and I'm going to drag over two things. Does anyone know the two things that I'm going to drag over? Pardon me? Well, I'm going to drag over, yeah, the database controls that will allow me to display the questions, but what are the actual names of the controls? Yes?
Datasource, a table.
A data source and a table, which the actual name is a grid view. All right, remember, when we're doing this, we're binding data. We have a visual component and we have the data component. And we bind them together to say this visual component gets its data from this data component. So we did that with sitemaps, and we're doing it here too. So they're under data. I'm going to drag over a SQL data source, and I'm going to drag over a grid view. I don't know why it's giving me those squigglies. Well, let's see if it gives us any problems going forward. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my data source. So I'll click here, Configure Data Source. which data connection should your application use? All right, if I did everything right, I should be able to go down here and pick polls.accdb. I can click next. It will ask me if I want to save the connection, and I'm going to say yes. I want my connection string to be in the web config file, because if something changes about the connection string, I want to have to only make that change in one place. So by doing it this way, by putting that connection string in the web config file, I can easily switch to a SQL Server database, for example, or change the name of the database, or change the database provider, or whatever. And all I have to do, theoretically, is change the connection string. So, next. What do I want to see? I'm going to go in and create a custom SQL statement, because I still want to practice my SQL. I want to select star from poll, order by date expires. All right. I can click test query, and it tells me that there's an error. All right. Most of the time, the error is going to be that you got a column wrong. Capital doesn't matter, but I'll bet I did something like,
Expired and not expired.
yeah, that would be my guess, date expired. There we go. So I said date expires, and it's actually date expired. Okay. So it's a good idea to do the test query. In general, it's a good idea to test a little piece of your code as you're doing it. All right? If I had ignored that test query button, I would run this, I would not get the results I wanted, and I might have a hard time understanding exactly like where it went wrong. Whereas if I do a little bit, test it, do a little bit, test it, then as soon as there's a problem, I can find out what the problem is. So I can hit finish. All right. So now I have my SQL data source. I can bind that to unrecognizable tag prefix or device filter. No idea why it's doing that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move on. I'm going to save this. I'm going to create another page, and I'm going to ignore the master page in case that's giving me grief. And I'll I'll go and recreate that. I'll put my SQL data source. And I will put my grid view. And SQL data source, I will say configure. I want that connection string. Next. That one. Next. Specify a column. Select. Test query, finish. Now I'm going to merge this with that, choose data source, SQL data source. And I'm going to make this the start page and run this. And we should see our database. I will look into that problem why I could not use, why it was giving me grief on that one.
Like that with the database,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't, with the master page, it would not let me use a grid view and stuff. I don't know why.
Yeah, I will have to look that up. I am not sure. I don't recall ever having that problem before. Anyhow, there we go. All right. And there's our questions. There's all that. Now, we can format this a few different ways, right? For example, I might not want to see the poll ID. The poll ID is just a number, all right? I might want to change the column names. And I can do that by going in to this guy and say, edit columns. So I can remove poll ID from the list. For this, I can change the name of the header to simply question. I can call this created and expires. This is one of those things that, like, how do I want to say this? If you want to impress me when I'm grading your work, take the extra 30 seconds to go and clean up those things. All right? So you're not using database column names with no spaces, something that might confuse the user just a little bit. All right? Put it in terms that the user would understand. All right? So that goes such a long way. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is if you're asking the question to yourself, I want to change how this looks, you're going to make your change to the grid view. If I want to say I want to change the content of the data, I want to change the SQL data source. All right, so data, changing the data source. Appearance, I'm changing the grid view. Now I'm going to look for one last thing here. I'm going to look at what it says in the web config file to make sure it created the data source correctly, and it did. Data directory. We want to see that. Because when I go and if I were a student and I turn this in, it's going to have my directory structure. If I don't use that data directory and I have the full physical path, then when I go to grade your assignment, I'm not going to have the same folders as you, and therefore I'll get an error. Yes?
But we should have that now that we're using that app.
Now that you're using app_data, and if you create it the way that I did, then it should be there. The test to make sure that it's correct is go and look and see data directory. All right. So any questions about this? Other than the master page debacle. All right, so now we're ready to look at the second SQL statement, or actually second SQL statements. Now for this, think for a second what the SQL statement to pull up just one question would be. What's the difference between a SQL statement here that's going to pull up just one question and a SQL statement up here that pulled up every question? Pardon me?
Star, which means all.
Well, the star means all columns. It doesn't mean all rows. All right? So I don't want to display on this page every question. I just want to display the question that they clicked on. So what does this SQL statement need that this SQL statement didn't have?
Specify the row.
Specify the row. Specify which specific row we want to. And how do we do that in terms of a SQL statement?
Where?
There's an extra clause, and that clause is the where clause. So, the data source for this guy could be select star from question, or from poll, where what? All right? And how do we identify the row in this table? How do we identify uniquely a row in a database table? Would be by the ID number. Right. So what's the primary key to this table? It's the poll ID. So if we're selecting, and we want to select one member of a table, what do we use? We use the primary key to that table. And that primary key, in this case, is a poll ID. It would be like, I went over to the college center, and I wanted to select one student that I wanted to talk to. So I'm standing on the steps of the college center. If I said, hey, George, I want to talk to you, I'm liable to get 3 Georges running up the steps to talk to me. If I said, hey, George Smith, I want to talk to you, I'm liable to get 2 George Smiths running up the stairs. But if I said, student that has an ID number of 368275, I want to talk to you, then only one person is going to come up there. All right? The primary key is what uniquely identifies. So if you want to pull a specific row from a table, you use the primary key. All right? So if I want to pull a specific student in a query, I'd use the primary key. All right? So where poll ID equals what? Well, this is a tricky part, right? Because it depends on which one we clicked on. Maybe this one is poll ID of 1, and this one is 3, and this one is 6, and this one is 2, and so on. So I want the poll ID of the one that I clicked on. So that's going to be different each time, right? Or that could be different each time. So I'm going to put a question mark here. And this question mark is going to get filled with the poll ID I clicked on. All right? That'll get filled in at runtime. In other words, I'm not going to put a specific value there. I don't always want to see poll 1, or I don't always want to see poll 2. Which poll do I want to see? I want to see the one the user clicked on. So I can't put that code in advance. I'm going to put a placeholder in there. I'm going to say whichever one they clicked on, that's the one I want to see. All right. So, that's this SQL statement. Now, how many rows is this going to return? 1. All right. Therefore, I don't really need a grid view. I don't really need a table. I'm going to use what's called a detail view for this. All right. A detail view shows you 1 row at a time. So I'm going to use a detail view for this. That's going to be the visual control. It won't be a grid view. It will be a detail view. I could use a grid view that only had 1 field in it, or 1 row in it, but that's kind of a waste. All right. What's a SQL statement that's going to go here?
Select all from answer.
Okay, select star from answers, from answer. And do we need to add anything else to that? Where? Because I don't want to see literally every single answer. All right? I only want to see the answers, what? That relate to this question. So where what? Where poll ID equals what?
Whatever it is.
Whatever they clicked on, right? Same thing here. So I don't know that now. That's going to be filled in at runtime. So I'm going to put a placeholder here. So that's going to be my 2 SQL statements. All right? So let's go in and let's put in a couple answers. And let's create this page. All right? And then we're going to link this page to this page. Let's see what time it is. We might be able to get to this. Let me go in and put in a couple answers. I didn't want to do that. Let me go and put in a couple answers. So the first poll is, what's your favorite energy drink? Do you like Halloween? So for poll 1, I'm going to put Red Bull as answer 1. For poll 1, answer 2, I'm going to put Monster. For poll 1, answer 3, I'm going to put Kickstart. For poll 2, answer 1, I'm going to put Yes. And for poll 2, answer 2, I'm going to put No. Now notice, because I've created that foreign key, I can't go in and add some poll that doesn't exist. Actually gives me an error. I can't add a record because the data is required in the table poll. So I'll change maybe to relate to this question. And I can't put a duplicate either, so I have to change that to make that unique. All right. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create a second page. File, new, website. No, file, new, file. Web form. And I'll call this poll and answers. So I'm going to put grid view, our first SQL data source, second SQL data source, details view, and a grid view. All right. first SQL data source. I'll go in and I'll say configure data source. What connection string do I want? I want the connection string that I've created. What do I want to see? I want to see select star from poll where poll ID equals question mark. The question mark being a placeholder. I click next. I have to say where that question mark is going to get filled in from, right? Now, we'll talk about this more, and I don't know if we'll get through this all today or if we will talk about this next time, but it's going to come from the query string. And I'm going to call it ID. All right, so remember that. I don't know if we'll have time to get to it today. Maybe I'll go a couple minutes over, and we'll finish this example at least once through, and then we can revisit it on Thursday. So the data is going to come from a query string, and it's going to be called ID. All right? I can test the query. Well, what's the value? I'm going to test it pulling up poll 1. And there's poll 1. Okay, that seemed to work. So I can finish that. And I can combine this with that data source. Second SQL data source I'm going to configure. Again, I want the connection string. Again, I want to write a custom SQL statement. I'm going to say select star from answer where poll ID equals question mark. Where is it going to come from? It's going to come from a query string. What's it called? ID. It's not a coincidence that I picked the exact same thing in both places, right? Because I'm going to put that ID in one place so that anyone that needs the ID can use it on this page. And that one place is the query string. So I hit next. I can test the query. Well, what if I enter in a poll ID of 1? Then there is an error. I'm going to cheat and use the query builder. Doesn't look like there's a table called answers. Answer, maybe I called it answers. I think that was it. And there's the 3 answers for that. Okay? So, last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and link this guy up with that second SQL data source. So, I have these 2 data sources expecting something on the query string. What is a query string? Pardon me? It's going to contain what ID the person clicked on. That's true. But in general terms, what's a query string? Let's go and Google something. I go to Google. I type something in. I'm going to search for ASP.NET. And I click return. Notice how you see Q equals ASP.NET. All right? Usually, you see a question mark, Q equals ASP.NET. All right? All right? Q equals, question mark, Q equals ASP.NET. Let's go to another. Let's try Yahoo. Maybe they do it a little bit different. All right. They sort of do it different, too. All right, here we go. Question mark, Q equals Zellers. All right. Everything after the question mark is what's called the query string. And the query string allows you to pass data from page 1 to page 2. In other words, on page 1, I put in what I'm searching for. I hit return, that submits it to page 2 to be processed. Well, page 2 needs to know what I entered in page 1. So I have to tell page 2, somehow I entered Zellers on page 1, or I entered Huffman on page 1, or whatever. One of the ways that you can pass data from one page to another is via the query string. So I hit that. It gets passed on the end of the URL after the question mark. All right? So what's our query string going to need to look like? It's going to need to look like this. Exactly. It's going to need to look like something like this. Polls. And answers. .aspx. Question mark. ID equals. And then whatever ID they clicked on. So maybe 2 or 1 or whatever. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to go back to my original page and I'm going to edit it. Okay, edit the columns. I'm actually going to delete the question column. And I'm going to add a hyperlink field. And the text for this, the text for this is going to come from the data text field. It's going to come from the question text. Here's where the fun starts, because here's where I put in what this is a link to. Here's where I put what it's linked. Polls, poll, and answer.aspx, question mark, ID equals, all right. Now here's the tricky part, because the rest of it, up to this point, it's pretty intuitive, right? This is what we want to link to, poll and answer.aspx, ID equals. Here we have to say where that value, that data is going to come from. And that data is going to come from the poll ID. So we put above it in the data navigate URL field poll ID, and we indicate that by doing curly bracket 0 curly bracket. What does curly bracket 0 curly bracket mean? It means the first field in this list, right? Because remember, in programming we always start counting with 0. So the first field is number 0, the second field is number 1. Now, in some cases, we might have 2 columns that we need to pass to the second page, in which case we'd have curly bracket 0, curly bracket 1. But here in this case, I only need to pass the poll ID. So the poll ID is going to get put wherever it says curly bracket 0. All right. So now that's a link. It's linked to my second page, and it's going to pass the ID on the query string. Let me just check, because it's pull and answers. Let me just check to make sure I got that spelling right. I did not. I didn't think I did. So now let's run this.
You have lowercase and.
That actually shouldn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. Microsoft servers really don't care about case. Possibly on an Apache web server, it might care. All right, so now, drum roll please. I click this. It shows me what is your favorite energy drink, along with the answers that are appropriate to that. If we look here, in the query string, you'll see, or if you look at the URL that got called, you'll see as part of the query string is the ID number that we entered in. That curly bracket 0 got replaced with the value of the ID. Just to show this wasn't a fluke, we can go back and do we like Halloween? And it will show yes, no, and maybe as the 3 possible answers. Now we certainly could format this to look better, but that's the basics. And this is a big deal, right? Because we've written what I call a parameterized query now. In other words, this query doesn't return the same results every time. This query returns different results depending on what you clicked on. So you can select something from your list and see the detail for that. All right, we will definitely go over this again next time. All right, but again, here's the start of this application. I will look into the master page issue also. Okay, I will go unlock the lab, and then I'll pick up my stuff from here, and I will be back in there.